Chris Jones from Deloitte joins me once again in the studio. In the first part of this interview, we focus on the oil industry. Now we're going to focus on broader issues facing the energy sector. Let's first start about talking about energy consumption. After the 2008-2009 recession, how did energy consumption actually get impacted?
Peter, I think in the case of households, the trend to energy consumption following the recession and the financial crisis in developed economies followed the trend with a lot of other household expenditure. That is to say that people looked for ways to economise and perhaps were more conscious about their costs. We, Deloitte, recently ran a study in the US of US consumers that showed exactly that. We talked about environmental attitudes as well as concerns over cost. And I think if I were to summarise that, I would say that the reductions in consumption that have been seen are much more driven by thrift than environmental concerns, although there is obviously a link there with both.
Are households simply concerned about cost when it comes to saving energy, or do environmental factors also play a part?
What consumers say in a lot of surveys that we and others have done is that it is important. What will be important is increasingly making that available to consumers as a choice. The policy agenda in many Western countries is clearly driving towards that. Renewable energy technology is improving massively, which makes it cheaper and a more viable source of power in many of these countries. And you only need to look, for example, at the big drive in many Western European countries to solar energy, wind energy in particular. That this is not just a trend, this is something that is absolutely part of the energy landscape.
The shale fields in North America are being exploited but at great economic and possibly environmental cost at the moment. And in the first part of this interview, we discussed how expensive oil is to drill now. Why are we still bothering to try and find fossil fuels in this way?
I think it comes back to something we touched on in our earlier interview, which is around the access to resources. The world's energy demand is not going downwards. Growth in developing economies, China, Brazil are often cited, but it's the reality, are driving a lot of the resource boom that we've seen in recent years. And that is absolutely true in energy as well. So everyone is looking for more longer term sources of energy. Renewables is a big part of that, but for the age of fossil fuels is not over.
Yep. So essentially you're saying that whilst there's a lot of discussion about renewable fuels, we're still very dependent on the traditional sources.
I think we're dependent on a mix of energy sources. It depends on which part of the world we're in as to what the energy sources are. We're here in Switzerland, for example, where there's much more hydroelectricity than in certain other parts of the world. But the overall global demand means that the search for energy and natural resources is going to continue for a long time.
Obviously, countries like China and India have been developing quickly for a while now. Are these countries helping to maintain a demand for fossil fuels?
The demand pull from Chinese manufacturing and industrialisation has had and will continue to have a big impact on the resource sector. You only need to look at the impact on demand for coal, for example, and many other commodities, steel, to see the impact that that's been having on the underlying supply and demand balance of those markets. That's true in fossil fuels as well, but it's certainly not true to say that as economies evolve, they will be solely dependent on fossil fuels any more than it's true to say that the only part of the world that still uses fossil fuels is China. If that's the case, we're all about to turn the lights out.
Thank you, Chris. That concludes our interviews about the energy sector with Deloitte. Stay tuned, we've always got more analysis and interviews to come here on Dukascopy TV. But for now, goodbye.